Conflicts that shaped Pharaonic Egypt. Lecture 5. The Narrow Door of the Desert. War in the South and the Birth of the Middle Kingdom.
After the end of the Old Kingdom, Egypt was essentially divided between a weakened pharaonic government based in Heracleopolis in the north, exerting some control over the Delta and Middle Egypt, with the head of the south, initially the first 4 southernmost districts of Egypt, each more or less going its own way under the direction of individual governors. Those same governors were both warring amongst themselves and at the same time professing loyalty to the northern rulers. Although the South appears to have suffered the most from a general collapse of the administrative and economic framework of the pharaonic state, the South also becomes the area of the greatest activity and ultimately is the birthplace of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. Whereas the local governors of the agriculturally rich northern part of the country appear to be rather complacent and languid, the rulers of the South, the governors of the head of the South, although food was in short supply, were rich in the products of the surrounding deserts. Perhaps more importantly, they were well supplied with Nubian soldiers. Throughout the course of the Old Kingdom, Egypt raided into the land south of Aswan, the region we call Nubia. Although Nubia developed alongside pre-dynastic Egypt, although northern Nubia shares to a great extent the cultural and even ideological developments of the Naqada II and even Naqada III periods, the dawn of the first dynasty in the Egyptian Nile Valley spells ultimate doom for much of the early Nubian culture. Egypt raids into Nubia, wanting not so much products, perhaps, as ultimately people. Old Kingdom inscriptions, especially a set from the site of Khor el-Akiba in Nubia, describe the bringing away of thousands of prisoners. Not so much to be slaves in the more modern sense of the term, but as forcefully recruited soldiers and workmen. At the time of the end of the Old Kingdom, as pharaonic central authority collapses, both under its own weight and as the result of the necessary farming out of much of that authority and administration to the provinces, as the central pharaonic power of the Old Kingdom collapses, a period of lower Nile floods hits Egypt. This does not lead to outright total food shortage, perhaps, but rather leads to localized famine. Much of what we know for this comes from Upper Egypt, an area that is not agriculturally rich. The inscriptions do not simply say there was no food and people were starving. Inscriptions will refer to the presence of grain ships. The impression one gets is that food was available but was not being distributed quite as well and efficiently as it had been under the Old Kingdom. Upper Egypt suffers particularly from this. The warring governors, increasingly at war with themselves and ultimately at war with their Heracleopolitan overlords in the north, begin to interfere with grain shipments. Food is used as a weapon by one governor against another. At the same time, in the south, lower Nubia had become somewhat depopulated, apparently as the result of continued Egyptian raids into the area south of Aswan. The local groups adopted a more semi-nomadic lifestyle. Although large habitation sites appear to have vanished from Lower Egypt in the later Old Kingdom, we have evidence of intensive activity in Nubian oases like Korkor and Donkul, southwest of Aswan. At the time of the collapse of the Old Kingdom, when Lower Nubia is somewhat depopulated, the groups still there having adopted a more semi-nomadic lifestyle, when Egypt is in the throes of food shortages, an influx of new people comes in to Lower Nubia and Upper Egypt. A Berber-speaking group we know archaeologically as the Sea Group. They were a rather militarized bunch, and they helped supply the military Nubian backbone of those Upper Egyptian governors who are fighting it out with themselves during the First Intermediate Period. One of the first personalities we know from this period, and one of the first strong personalities we know from ancient Egypt as a whole, is the governor, or nomarch, as we call them, of the 3rd district of Upper Egypt, a man named Ankhtifi, based at the city of Hefat, somewhere near modern Mo'alla, south of Luxor. Ankhtifi left us a series of bombastic, egotistic, self-serving, but incredibly interesting and fun to read inscriptions in his rather strangely carved tomb at Mo'alla. Ankhtifi recounts how he invaded the 2nd district, the district south of his own, in order to restore order. At the same time, he challenges the district of Thebes to the north. He talks about coming out with his army and roaming around west of Thebes, looking for somebody to fight, but nobody would come out to fight with him. Eventually, however, the governor of Thebes comes to dominate all of Upper Egypt as far north as Abydos. By the reign of Governor Antef II of Thebes, who styles himself King Antef the Great, Antef Aa. By the reign of Antef II, Thebes controls the old head of the south, the 8 southernmost districts of Egypt. This is rather interesting. Thebes was apparently a small and relatively insignificant city during the Old Kingdom. Suddenly, during the First Intermediate Period, Thebes comes to dominate all of Upper Egypt. The reason for the ascendancy of Thebes is an important geopolitical feature of the region that we will see come into play again during the Second Intermediate Period. The region of Naqada gives its name to the major cultures of the Egyptian pre-dynastic, not only because they were first identified there, but because the region of Naqada is essentially the center of those 3 proto-kingdoms of Abydos, Hierakonpolis, and Naqada is Naqada. Naqada was the focal point of the development of the Upper Egyptian pre-dynastic cultures. One of the reasons the Kenaband region of the Nile, the area of Naqada, became so important is because the shortest of the eastern desert roads between the Red Sea and the Upper Egyptian Nile comes into the Nile Valley in the Kenaband, around the city of Koptos. The shortest of the desert roads between the Upper Egyptian Nile and the closest of the southern oases of the western desert leaves the Kenaband region of the Nile, in the area of Girga, south of Abydos, heading out to Kharga Oasis. The Kenaband, while agriculturally somewhat insignificant, is the central point of the best and shortest desert roads through the eastern and western deserts leading into and out of the Upper Egyptian Nile Valley. When you look at where those desert roads come into the Nile Valley, you very soon see that there is only one place from which a ruler could control easily and directly both the best of those eastern desert roads, the Wadi Hammamat Road, and the best of those western desert roads, the Girga Road. And that place is the area of old Nakada and ancient Thebes. Thebes rises in importance because all of a sudden, in this cut-off, warring head of the south, she is best placed to control the caravan roads and the supply roads that are the backbone of the Upper Egyptian economy, and she is best placed to maneuver her armies through the desert. Fortunately, we know something of how this happened. The governors of the 5th district of Upper Egypt, the governors of Coptos, traditionally were the overseers of desert traffic in Upper Egypt by the end of the Old Kingdom. We know that the last governors of the 5th district, that district just north of Thebes, the last governors of that district who were loyal to those Heracleopolitan rulers, who were loyal to the 9th and 10th dynasties in the north, a man named Usur and his successor Chauti, appear to have been members in some way, related in some way to the Heracleopolitan royal family. They used the title God's father, beloved of the god. That means they had some sort of relationship to the royal family. They were governing the 5th district. But, interestingly enough, they were no longer governing from the side of Coptos. They were governing from the far southern border of their district. Why were they doing that? Why would they move apparently their base of operation and their burial places to the region of Khozam just north of Luxor? At their very southern border is where they seem to have spent their time. Well, one might suggest they spent their time because they knew trouble was coming and they knew whence that trouble would come. They knew it would come from Thebes. In fact, we now know this, thanks to an inscription discovered at Jebel Chauti in the Kenna Bend back in 1995, an inscription my expedition, the Theban Desert Road Survey, discovered in the Kenna Bend of the Nile. We know something of what happened. The last pro-Heracleopolitan governor of Coptos, the man named Chauti, whose false door is now in the Cairo Museum, left an inscription on the desert surface, on the Jebel, near an ancient road. And he said, I have made this, apparently some improvement to the road, I have made this for the purpose of crossing this desert, which the ruler of another district has annexed. He uses the Egyptian term khatem, to annex. That means to put your signet seal on it, to stamp it with your seal ring. Another ruler, the ruler of another nome, has annexed the desert, and he's had to make a new road. Well, to whom would Chauti be referring? Almost certainly to his southern counterpart and deadly foe, the governor Antef of Thebes. It looks as though Antef of Thebes finally did what we know the Thebans could do if we look on the map. Antef of Thebes seized control of the desert roads. Chauti's predecessor Usur calls himself the overseer of the eastern and the western desert. Chauti does not call himself that. On his funerary monument, he calls himself the overseer of the narrow door of the south. A desert road, a desert pass is called a narrow door by the Egyptians. His world is much diminished. His predecessor oversaw the eastern and the western deserts, and now he oversees a desert road. It may not simply be the desert road, it may be a desert road. Next to Chauti's inscription, we discovered another inscription, a very large cursive inscription, very boldly drawn, and it said, the shock troops of the son of Re, Antef. Apparently, Antef, the governor of Thebes, had very quietly but definitely taken control of the desert roads in the eastern and the western desert. The eastern desert roads could easily be controlled by Chauti from Coptos. The western desert roads could easily have been controlled from the area of Girga and Abydos. But only Antef of Thebes could achieve direct desert access to both of those roads out from his own home city without going through areas potentially controlled by other rulers and enemy armies. Thebes seized control of the roads. That last pro-Heracleopolitan governor of the 5th dynasty tried to do something against it, and Antef promptly captured his road as well. This explains why the only fighting of which we have written evidence during the First Intermediate Period in the south is in the desert west of Abydos. Apparently, Antef II took advantage of the desert roads seized probably by his predecessor Antef I to march from Thebes into Abydos, the 8th district. By marching along that desert road into the west and cutting off the Kenna bend of the Nile, the Theban armies could go between the 4th and the 8th districts directly, bypassing entirely armies in the 5th, 6th, and 7th districts. Since we know that those last pro-northern governors of the 5th district were massing their forces on the southern border of the 5th nome, what greater catastrophe could befall the Heracleopolitans than that the Thebes turn their flank, go through the narrow door of the desert, debouche out of the desert into the Nile Valley in the area of Abydos, fight one battle, and capture all of the 8 southernmost districts of Upper Egypt. After some desultory fighting around Thinis in the 8th Upper Egyptian nome during the reign of Antef II, including a Heracleopolitan counterattack in which, horror of horrors, the cemetery of Thinis was destroyed, Antef II advanced into the 10th Upper Egyptian nome. Eventually, the Theban king Mentuhotep II put an end to the loosely organized Heracleopolitan kingdom around 2025 BCE and ushered in the first part of what we call the Middle Kingdom. This is, the Theban kingdom, is what we call the 11th dynasty, and the final portion of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep II and his successors, is the Theban-based, somewhat parochially Theban-centered phase of the Middle Kingdom. As the end drew near, the Heracleopolitans came to rely closely on the governors of the Upper Egyptian nome 15 in Middle Egypt, based at Asyut. These people appear to have provided the core for the late Heracleopolitan armies. Of course, the Thebans, as we have seen, had direct access to great Nubian forces and Nubian archers, men accomplished at desert warfare, men adept at living in the marginal environments through which they would have to march and in which they would have to fight if the Thebans were to put into play their advantage of control over the desert roads. One of the first things that Mentuhotep II does when he takes control of Egypt is promptly ensure that Thebes has even greater access to the great recruiting grounds of Lower Nubia. Mentuhotep II, in an inscription he left that was found at the site of Deir el-Balas, north of western Thebes, states that one of his initial main goals of his reign was to integrate northern Nubia and the oases of the western desert into the Upper Egyptian economy. Mentuhotep II, on the Balas inscription, says there was no ruler before to whom they paid taxes. Tribute came in from the western desert. Tribute came in from Lower Nubia. The loot of attacks, the loot of those enforced recruitments of Nubian soldiers flowed into Egypt, but not actual tax money. Mentuhotep II integrates Lower Nubia and the oases of the western desert into the greater pharaonic state. Although we have evidence for long-distance trade through the roads of the Western Desert during the Old Kingdom and even the First Intermediate period, Mentuhotep II sets in play a definite program of expanding the pharaonic state by integrating Lower Nubia and the oases of the Western Desert. The products of Lower Nubia would include, of course, more of those soldiers to swell the ranks of the mercenary armies in the south. Access to the oases would be a bit more subtle. The oases did not produce great quantities of wealth, but they produced a constant agricultural supply that was not based on the flooding of the Nile River. Access to the agricultural wealth of as many of the Western Desert oases as possible would provide the Egyptians with a minimum agricultural income for planning for worst-case scenarios of Nile Valley crop yields in times of bad Nile floods. Just as Mentuhotep II says he wants these people to become good tax-paying Egyptians, archaeologically and epigraphically on the ground, we find evidence that the Egyptians did just that. At Kurkur Oasis, southwest of Aswan, in the early Middle Kingdom, the Egyptians constructed a small dry stone rectangular building where we see Egyptian and Nubian pottery mixed together. Apparently the base of one of the local tax collectors whom Mentuhotep II says he set up, including a local agent at Aswan. Out on the main Girga Road, the shortest Western Desert road connecting ancient Thebes with Karga Oasis, the closest of the southern oases to the Nile, out on the Girga Road for the early Middle Kingdom, we see a large water and food depot at a site called Abu Ziyar, with evidence that tax workers from Egypt were being sent out on that road to help set up and maintain that depot, probably on their way out to the oases of the Western Desert. We know from the time of the early Middle Kingdom that the oases were sort of no man's lands, places where some of the criminal elements of the First Intermediate period, people who had thrived during those lawless times of the Heracleopolitans and the warring governors of the head of the South, places where those criminals had gone when they saw the long arm of pharaonic control beginning to extend itself along the Nile Valley out of Thebes. The early Middle Kingdom has to suppress these outlaws in the oases, bring these people under control in order to establish pharaonic activity in the area. And we see the actual expenditure of funds and equipment by the pharaonic state during the early Middle Kingdom to set up outposts like Abu Ziyar. The pottery at Abu Ziyar is almost exclusively of a type of marl called marl C, that is a marker of the royal residence, of the royal capital. The early pharaonic state of the Middle Kingdom is intent on expending great resources in order to increase its agricultural, tax, and military base. The early rulers of the Middle Kingdom, the Mentuhoteps, Mentuhotep II and his successors, rule from Thebes. At the end of the 11th dynasty and the beginning of the 12th dynasty, a new ruler emerges who is not related to the old Theban governors, a man named Amenemhat, whom we know as Amenemhat I. He does not appear to have been related to the earlier royal family, and in fact there is some very slim evidence that he might possibly have been the vizier of the last of the Mentuhoteps. A vizier, in fact, whom we know from an inscription in the Wadi Hammamat, had been dispatched by the king to bring back a suitable stone for the king's sarcophagus. Egyptologists like to see a view in which Amenemhat brought back the sarcophagus, helped put the last Mentuhotep in the sarcophagus, and then took over as Amenemhat I, but we can't exactly know that. One of the things we know, however, is that Amenemhat I moved from Thebes to a new capital city, just as the rulers of the first dynasty moved from ancient Abydos in the south, their home base, to a new city to symbolize their rule over unified Egypt. So Amenemhat I moved from his old home base of Thebes to a new city set up, once again, better to show his rule over a unified Egypt. The city is in the vicinity of modern Lisht, not far from Heracleopolis, near the mouth of the Fayum, southwest of ancient Cairo, ancient Memphis. The city was called Ichitawi, the one who seizes, who takes up the two lands, a slightly more pugnacious version of the old Mechat Tawi, balance of the two lands, for Memphis. The situation Amenemhat I inherited was not a healthy one. We know from numerous inscriptions that sometime during his reign, apparently during the second decade of his reign, some sort of war broke out within Egypt. We know from the inscriptions of local governors in Middle Egypt, in the quarry of Hatnub, that Egypt around this time was beset by enemy military units. But interestingly enough, they don't have a single origin. We know from the descriptions of these enemy units in those quarry inscriptions that the forces were formed by various foreigners, Nubians, Asiatics, and Egyptians as well. This does not seem to be a time of foreign invasion, but a time of some sort of civil war. No individual name of a single enemy survives. But one of the inscriptions from Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt mentions a someone who has seized power. But we know that things were rather desperate. One of the Beni Hassan inscriptions, one of the local governor's inscriptions, has a text recording how the king wrote to him and said, "Get together your own troops. Look, I'm busy up here with my own as it is." Actually, the grammatical form the king uses stresses the fact that he'd come if he could, but he can't because he's busy. War has broken out throughout Egypt. This appears to have been a mercenary army war. Somewhat like the 30 Years' War in Europe, the mercenaries themselves and their wars take on a life of their own. The newfound peace has not brought necessarily newfound prosperity to those foreigners who entered Egyptian service in such great numbers, Asiatics in the north and Nubians in the south during the first intermediate period. Apparently out of work mercenary armies, perhaps loosely under some single command, are keeping the king and his governors busy throughout Egypt. We are fortunate that from the south, from what we might call the port of the oasis of Kurkur, south of Aswan, a group of inscriptions once existed, now underwater beneath the waters of the lake behind the Aswan High Dam. A group of inscriptions from Abisko, south of Aswan, give us great insight into this period of internal turmoil that follows the reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II. Fortunately, before they were covered by the waters behind the Aswan High Dam, Egyptologists recorded a series of inscriptions at a site called Abisko, south of Aswan. These inscriptions form the autobiographical text of a Nubian soldier named Chehemau. We do not know his rank in the Egyptian army, but he tells us that he was personally recruited into the Egyptian army when Mentuhotep II himself visited Lower Nubia. Chehemau is proud of the fact that he is a Nubian. At the same time, he's extremely proud of his personal influence in the wars within Egypt during the early Middle Kingdom. He is proud of being a soldier in the Egyptian army, and he is proud of his Nubian heritage at the same time. He gives us not only an interesting glimpse into the history of the early Middle Kingdom, but at something of the multicultural society that existed in Upper Egypt and throughout Egypt at the time. Chahamau describes fighting what appear to be a group of Asiatics somewhere in the south. He is traveling by water on some occasions. He is traveling by land across desert roads on others. He's fighting all throughout Egypt, it appears, on behalf of the king. He refers at one point to a Theban army being put to flight by an enemy, and he says, "It was the Nubian Chahamau who turned things around." In another inscription, which is almost certainly intended to be semi-comic, he describes coming out of the desert at Thebes along the desert road and finding Thebes all collected on the riverbank. That's where people would go for a religious festival, and they would chant these songs to the ruler, etc. They would chant religious hymns during these festivals. Chahamau shows up at a religious festival, and apparently in his mind, this becomes somewhat comically a celebration of welcome for Chahamau, and he actually claims that they sang a song about him. Perhaps they did. Chahamau, in any event, provides us with some evidence of what's going on in Egypt during the early Middle Kingdom. The fact that Mentuhotep II secured the recruiting grounds of Lower Nubia for Upper Egypt, the fact that he secured access to more of these mercenaries so he could make sure that the First Intermediate Period would never happen again, actually ensured that something not dissimilar to the First Intermediate Period happened at the cusp of the 11th and 12th dynasties. Ultimately, Amenemhat I is victorious. He does put down this mercenary war and rebellion of some sort of anti-pharaoh who had ultimately set himself up in this time of turmoil. And the High Middle Kingdom, the 12th dynasty, begins. We see with Chahamau's inscriptions a man born a Nubian who used through his life a Nubian name, who nevertheless presents himself in a very clear, self-possessed, we might say comically egotistical, bombastic way, just like that earlier governor of the 3rd district, Anktifi. Both of these men are very full of themselves. In fact, if their texts weren't so beautifully written and literarily interesting, they would be off-putting in the amount of bombast and self-presentation they present. This is interesting because already in the late Old Kingdom, we see private individuals beginning to tell us more about themselves. It was not considered polite in most Old Kingdom inscriptions to write out the first-person pronoun. We generally have to reconstruct that. We usually know where it occurred. But apparently, in a somewhat self-effacing, polite way, you simply did not write I all the time. This begins to change in the late Old Kingdom for local governors, etc. One of the local governors of Aswan at the far southern border of Egypt during the 6th dynasty, a man named Harhuf, is very proud of himself. He talks about all of his great exploits in the desert, how he tricks a Nubian army that was going out to fight a group of Libyans into becoming his own personal escort. He records for us the content of a letter he received from the king himself regarding a dancing pygmy or dwarf that he is bringing back with himself from the far south. He was one of the first African explorers of whom we know both the name and the deeds. The pharaoh lags behind this. We don't know that much personally about rulers. Really, it is that Balas inscription of Mentuhotep I that first begins to come close, to some extent, with his predecessor's funerary monument, the funerary monument of Amenhotep II, the so-called Hound Stela. It's really first that Balas inscription of Mentuhotep II that introduces us to something of the personality, of the daily speech, perhaps, of an Egyptian ruler. This is something that is new because the king is always archaic. The pharaoh is always archaizing in his deeds and his activities and how he appears. The Egyptian pharaohs were representatives of the gods on earth, and in certain cases, they actually tried to reign as divine beings during their lifetimes. We'll see this for Amenhotep III and Akhenaten in particular. The pharaoh was at the top of all of Egyptian society. In theological terms, he also held power over all foreign territories and their inhabitants, since they were under the Egyptian cosmos and under the control of the Egyptian gods, whether they liked it or not. To combat chaotic elements of the universe, the pharaoh could construct temples, he could commission all sorts of engineering projects, he could go to war. Depending upon the historical situation during a particular reign, a pharaoh might succeed massively in one or more such projects. Although Egyptian civilization is often viewed as monolithic and unchanging, modes of expression of pharaonic kingship and emphasis placed on particular royal roles varies during pharaonic history. In the beginning, the king is the earthly manifestation of the cosmic deity Horus. During the High Old Kingdom, as we discussed with the change in pyramid architecture, the king really becomes the sun god Re. He becomes the vicar of Re, even the sun god himself on earth. He sits as a god on earth, the static core of an ever-repeated series of ritualized events. He does not so much make history as interpret history. He provides the ritualization of historical events. His subjects may begin to say, I did this and I did that. Let Pharaoh put this in cosmic terms. Pharaoh himself very seldom appears as more of a glimpse in the Old Kingdom. In fact, one of the most personal representations of an Old Kingdom ruler is, in fact, in that letter of the king recorded in the inscriptions of Harhuf and Aswan. On the other hand, from the late Old Kingdom through the First Intermediate period, private individuals in their autobiographical inscriptions place an increasing emphasis on what the person does. They place an emphasis on their personal skills, things they did. Incidents of the moment then begin to take a greater importance. They begin to assume a greater importance. They begin to take place over the ritualization of history in the private monuments. Pride in personal achievement emerges in private texts well before it emerges in royal inscriptions. A corresponding increase in historical detail appears in private inscriptions, in the inscriptions of the local governors, in inscriptions like those of Chehemau, before they appear in royal inscriptions. The king lags behind this self-presentation, and only really with the dawn of the Middle Kingdom, with Mentuhotep II, do we also begin to see the emergence of a true royal personality in the royal inscription. The new genre placed on the personal ability of the ruler, both mental and physical, provides the groundwork for a literary form called the royal novel. They make a nod to the need of the king to present himself as cosmic ruler. These royal texts attempt to interpret history in a somewhat stereotypic form. They are formulaic. Nevertheless, these autobiographical texts relate no small amount of actual information regarding the historical achievements and personality of the king. They generally take the form of a dialogue between the king and a group of advisors. The advisors tend to be timid. The king tends to be bold. The advisors argue caution. Generally speaking, the king doesn't listen. But occasionally, as in the annals of Thutmose III from the 18th dynasty, the king does bow to, apparently, the greater wisdom in some cases of his advisors. So, although squeezed into somewhat of a formulaic corset, a great deal of royal personality nevertheless begins to emerge. This emphasis on the royal personality is something that becomes important through the Middle Kingdom with the development of the concept of the ruler as the good shepherd, the worried ruler who spends the night awake thinking of things he can do for the gods and for Egypt. So in the morning, he wakes up tired with baggy eyes, but clearly in charge of the pharaonic state. We actually see that as Middle Kingdom sculpture develops, particularly the portraiture of Sesostris III, this very tired, weary look on the face of the ruler, not showing that he's a bad ruler, but showing that he stayed up all night thinking of the best things to do for the Egyptians.
This ends Lecture 5.